Donald Trump was just ordered to pay $355 million as part of a civil trial in New York City. Take a look right here at the New York Times coverage. Trump ordered to pay $355 million and barred from New York business. So that's really the second part of this decision. It was brought down by Judge Arthur Engoron because, again, it's a civil suit. So in that case, let's go through a little bit of the New York Times reporting, but also some things you're probably not going to hear from the corporate press. Now, again, George Arthur Engoron is someone we've heard a lot about because he's been going back and forth with Trump in this, at this point, a years-long case. It's civil fraud, and as the New York Times says, it found the former president liable for conspiring to manipulate his net worth, and then his penalty was this $355 million that could actually wipe out his entire stockpile of cash. That's important because Donald Trump has recently testified essentially that what he has in cash is about $400 million of cash. So if you put the $355 million together with about the $80 million that Donald Trump was ordered to pay to E. Jean Carroll recently, that does basically wipe out his entire roughly $400 million of cash. Now, a little bit more from this case and from the New York Times. It's a fairly useful article that was just up on the screen because they even call this a chaotic case. It was brought by New York's Attorney General, Letitia James. We'll get to her in just a moment. We'll get to Engoron in just a moment as well. And Trump in this case said there were no victims. The defense actually brought people from different businesses, Deutsche Bank, forward to testify, and they referred to Donald Trump as, quote, a whale client. They were very happy to have Donald Trump as a client. They actually used other mechanisms to gauge his wealth. So the argument on behalf of Donald Trump was basically, listen, there were no victims in this case. Engoron, in addition to ordering the $355 million payment, actually also imposed a 3-year ban from Donald Trump, as the Times puts it, serving in top roles at any New York company, including his own. And he also, as the New York Times says, applied that punishment to the former president's adult sons for 2 years, and he ordered them to pay $4 million each. Eric Trump is the Trump organization's right now top guy. So this throws everything, as the New York Times says, into doubt as to whether Eric Trump can retain his management of the company or his oversight in the company. And again, one of the reasons I like this Times article is because they also refer to Judge Engoron's, quote, unconventional style. That's really an understatement. If you dig back, there's a decent bit of coverage on Engoron basically being an eccentric. And the Times, I think, is capturing that in this article without sort of going all the way, which is to go all the way, you would have to bring in the drumbeat of criticism that Engoron has gotten, not just from sort of the conservative legal types who maybe hate Donald Trump but really care about rule of law and all of those different things, but actually the Associated Press published a report in January that went and asked legal experts what they thought of this case that New York Attorney General Letitia James brought. This is a little bit from, I'll just start with the headline. Dissolving Trump's business empire would stand apart in the history of New York fraud law. That's the headline of the Associated Press story. They continue to say an Associated Press analysis of nearly 70 years of civil cases under the law showed that such a penalty has only been imposed a dozen previous times, and Trump's case stands apart in a significant way. It's the only big business found that was threatened with a shutdown without a showing of obvious victims and major losses. So actually that's interesting because that was part of Donald Trump's defense, that there were no obvious victims. The Associated Press added some legal experts worried that if the judge goes out of his way to punish the former president with that worst case scenario, which was taking away actually his assets, so not just ordering the cash at the time, people were sort of thinking Engoron might yank all of Trump's business assets. The Associated Press said that could make it easier for courts to wipe out companies in the future, according to the experts it talked to. One expert from Columbia University said this is basically a death penalty for a business. Is he just getting his desserts because of the fraud or because people don't like him? Another expert, this is a New York real estate lawyer who once successfully sued a Trump condo building for misrepresenting his sales to lure buyers, says this sets a horrible precedent. A University of Michigan law professor said, who suffered here? We haven't seen a long list of victims. The AP continues, the only case they found of a business dissolved under the anti-fraud law without citing actual victims or losses was a relatively small company closed in 1972 for writing term papers for college students. In that case, the Attorney General said the victim was, quote, the integrity of the educational process. They add AP's review of nearly 150 reported cases since New York's reported fraud statute was passed in 1956 showed that nearly every previous time a company was taken away, victims and losses were key factors. Customers had lost money or bought defective products or never received services ordered, leaving them cheated and angry. Again, in this case, the defense brought witnesses said they didn't feel cheated, they didn't feel angry, they actually were glad to have Donald Trump as a client. And Letitia James, the New York Attorney General, argued that they could have made more money. And that's what that $355 million is supposed to represent, is the additional money that could have been made if Donald Trump had represented his assets appropriately. So again, the AP says the only case they found of a business dissolved under the anti-fraud lawsuit without citing actual victims or losses was that, quote, relatively small company that closed in 1972 for writing term papers for college students. Now, I'm going to pause right here because I think that's really important. I actually think it's really important that there is oversight of multimillionaires and billionaires who get away with fudging the law, who get away with preventing prosecution by having prosecutors in their pocket, by having attorneys general in their pocket, by having great legal teams, the best you can buy. I actually think that's really very, very important. What we see here is likely a clear violation of the law as it is written, which is pretty straightforward about misrepresenting assets. The law, however, has never been enforced in this way, with the exception of one case of a tiny company, not a massive company like the Trump Organization with with billions of dollars in real estate assets, frankly. And so the fact that you even have this Associated Press story from last month analyzing this and quoting legal experts who were worried about the precedent this case was going to set. Now, again, his assets weren't totally yanked, but that $400 million, $355 million payment is incredibly significant. And that's worth pausing to think about. As much as many of us would love to see multimillionaires, billionaires like Donald Trump held accountable for getting away with practices that other people get audited for and have to spend thousands of dollars defending themselves for and would go to jail for. As much as we would all like to see the law apply to them, to see them play by the rules just as much as the rest of us who don't have lots of money and influence to skirt the rules get out of it, does anybody think that this is now going to be applied equally to Democrats who violate this law, to people on the left who violate this law, to apolitical people who violate this law? And that's what I find, frankly, to be disturbing about this. Because, again, as much as I personally would love to see any multimillionaire, billionaire who's breaking the law face the rightful consequences for it and not pay their way out of punishment, civil punishment, criminal punishment. That is not what is happening here. And Letitia James is not suddenly eager to investigate, for example, believe it or not, one of her benefactors is the Soros family. There's a good reporting on this, actually. The Daily Wire was the first to report this. Fox News went and echoed it. Letitia James's candidacy, where she promised to get Trump on this very partisan basis, was actually backed by multiple members of the Soros family and Reid Hoffman, billionaire Reid Hoffman, partisan billionaire Reid Hoffman, who, in the same way that partisan billionaires on the right are benefactors to major politicians, Reid Hoffman has also been sort of a dark money, many of you know, a dark money benefactor to a lot of Democrats. And so that's who boosted Letitia James. Does anybody in their right mind think that Letitia James is now going to turn her investigative muster over to George Soros or Reid Hoffman or their friends? Likely not. Engoron himself had given exclusively to Democrats, about $5,000 to Democrats, so a meager sum compared to Soros and Reid Hoffman and Letitia James, but it's still worth noting that's somewhat unusual for a judge like Engoron. He donated to the former New York Attorney General. He donated to David Patterson. So it's pretty interesting that Engoron also has this history One time he said he would share a, quote, controversial view. This is actually on tape. He said, "Now I'm going to say something controversial even though I'm being taped." This video is from about 8 years ago. "Juries get it wrong a lot. That's my own opinion. I do only civil trials, personal injury cases, contract disputes, but I've had situations where like, oh my, heaven's sake, how could they have thought that? Well, I have a tool that I can deal with that. It's called judgment, notwithstanding the verdict. I can say there's no possible way that a reasonable jury would have reached that conclusion. All right, am I following the law or am I making the law? Okay, I'm following the law. I'm an impartial referee, but it's hard to factor out my own emotions. I have tools." Elise Stefanik had filed, who's a Trump backer, no question about it. She actually complained that, quote, Engoron had illegally gagged Trump's protected political speech. This is according to NBC News, violated political giving rules with financial contributions to Democrats as recently as 2018, and ignored a decision on the appropriate statute of limitations in the case. Stefanik also noted that at the start of the trial, Engoron infamously smiled and posed for the cameras, which is true, although I'm not sure that is legally of a vulnerability for Judge Engoron in those cases. So again, this is from the New York Times. Even though the lenders made money from Trump, they were the purported victims in the case, with Letitia James arguing that absent his fraud, they could have made even more. The financial penalty reflects those lost profits, with nearly half of the $355 million, $168 million representing the interest that Mr. Trump saved, and the remaining sum representing his profit on the recent sale of 2 properties, money that the judge has now clawed back. They called as witnesses the president's former bankers, who testified that they had been delighted to have Mr. Trump as a client. I'm reading this from the New York Times, by the way. Several of them said that they had not relied on his annual financial statements, but had independently assessed his wealth. Trump is obviously appealing this, and if upheld, the Times says an appeal could erase the cushion of liquidity, cash, stocks. If this is upheld against an appeal, it could erase that cushion of liquidity that Trump built in his post-presidential life, because he had claimed actually under oath last year that he was sitting on about $400 million of cash. So when you put that $355 million together with the $83 million payout to E. Jean Carroll, that's really big trouble in terms of Donald Trump's cash flow. So all this is to say, once again, I think it's pretty clear if you look at the records, maybe not about Mar-a-Lago, which Engoron had come up with some absurd evaluation for, but when you look at Donald Trump's record, I don't think it comes as a surprise to anyone, at least of all his voters, that he was engaged in, what did he say? That makes me smart, when he was pressed on some maneuvering, that white-collar maneuvering that he had previously done. I think that was in reference to taxes. He said that when he was running in like 2015. I don't think that comes as a surprise to absolutely anybody. And personally, I think I'm looking at this, I think it looks like, yeah, he was doing, like, he was engaged in funny business. Not surprising, and not unusual, by the way. What is unusual is that Donald Trump is being plucked out from the group of people that make similar or conduct their business similarly. Donald Trump is being singled out of this group for doing what everyone else is doing, essentially, but just doing it in really high profile, as a really high profile person, probably the most high profile person in the world, and getting prosecuted on that basis and being ordered to pay that on this basis. You don't have to take my word for it, because I'm not a legal expert. You can take the word from the experts that the Associated Press interviewed actually on this issue, who unanimously said that the precedent here would be concerning, and that this case was being pursued, this victimless civil case was being pursued in an overzealous way. That is really troubling when you're doing that to a member of one party. If I thought this was the beginning of a bunch of dominoes falling, of liberal billionaires, Reid Hoffman, people who are, you could probably put money on whether or not they're conducting business in similar ways if you lifted the hood and could do a full, the most zealous audit that you possibly could conduct. If I thought that this was the beginning of one domino, I'd be out there with the rest of people who acknowledge that the multimillionaires and billionaires are getting away with a whole lot of funny business in this country, which Donald Trump basically acknowledged himself. People kind of knew that. It was baked into the electoral cake about him. It doesn't make it right. Politically, though, it doesn't mean that this is going to hurt him all that much, even though, again, when you look at Letitia James being backed by big Democrat money, anti-Trump Democratic money, it seems like in a lot of ways they thought they could, prevent Trump from beating them at the ballot box by beating him in court. And this is definitely not going to help them at the ballot box. It's plainly not. He has a lot of other cases pending. Some may be more problematic for him politically than others. But I think the real problem with this case is their decision to start making unprecedented lawfare. And I say lawfare because, again, I'm all for prosecuting powerful politicians who make millions and millions of dollars by fudging the rules, and if not billions of dollars by fudging the rules, only if we're doing it on a nonpartisan basis. And I see absolutely no indication that this is going to happen on a nonpartisan basis. So if this decision leaves you with a pit in your stomach, you're not alone. That's definitely where I feel like I am right now. Trump is certain to appeal it, and we'll see where that appeal goes, and we'll continue to cover it for you here and follow it for you here at Breaking Points.